Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to continue with the history part of our class. Today we'll start really going into the printing press, which is chapter 1 in the Kovarik book. So we are following the books. On that note, I've gotten from group chat and other sources that some of you are having some issues in conducting the class. I want to do the best job I can for you. Anyone want to have any suggestions on what we can do better? Okay. I just want to be able to help. Anyway, what we'll do is continue with the history parts. On the last essays that well, someone actually said in the chat to do. So, okay, someone had a comment in the chat. Yes, get rubrics on the essays. Well, and that's true. If you look at the grades, most people did pretty well. And the assignments are a little broad. You to really think yourself, but I guess you need a little bit more structure. And I do hear you, so I'll work on that. Anyway, but I do hear you, and I want to do the best job I can for you. Anyway, on the last set of essays, again, most people did well. The one issue was that a lot of people did not do things that were really in the media. Perfume, clocks. The assignment was a media product, and again, it was about, we had to have a media thing. Also, that also a lot of people didn't use their outside sources. Yeah, yes, and we will try to give you more fuller feedback. Of course, this is, I allow you to do the drafts beforehand, and frankly, with the number of students I have, it's a challenge to work on every little bit. Again, the essays are pretty good. I'll have a little bit stronger guidelines in the future on what I'm looking for, but I do hear you.
So did you like what I put for the title of my essay?
Oh, yours was great. And I know a lot of people are, I know a lot of people are concerned. I appreciate your creativity, and I want to encourage you to use your own voices. And so, yeah, and that means things might be a tad vague sometimes, but I am here to help. Anyway, what we'll do today is talk about the Middle Ages. If you remember, last time we we were talking about how civilization, Western civilization, had kind of petered out, had faded out. Remember early on, we talked about empires and how, given the Greeks and Romans, you had a common language, you had a common road and transportation system, so you could have ideas and literature pass back and forth. Everyone has the same language. Dark Ages come in, you have, Rome collapses and you don't have that unity anymore. People aren't speaking the same language. So this is the situation. Let me get another browser for this. Here it is.
Meet Janus, the Roman pleb, and John, the medieval peasant. Janus lives in a 4-story apartment building in the sprawling city of Rome. John lives in a thatch hut in one of the hundreds of tiny villages scattered around medieval Europe. Janus went to school. He can read and write. Right now, Janus is using this skill to draw lewd graffiti. But if he so desired, he had access to thousands of pieces of literature from all over the empire at one of Rome's many libraries. John doesn't even know what a school is, let alone a library. He's only ever heard of one book, the Bible. And at any rate, the only person in the village who can read is the priest. Janus starts his day off with a trip to the baths, where he soaks in the hot tubs and then has a drink of water from a nearby fountain. John hasn't had a bath in months. In fact, he's fairly certain that baths are sinful, though he's not sure why. The closest thing John has to running water is a nearby stream. Janus spends his day off attending one of Rome's many festivals. He catches the first play of an annual theater competition. From there, he heads to the horse races at the Circus Maximus. Tired of the ponies, Janus wanders around the market, where he touches silk from China, tastes olives from Greece, sees paper from Egypt, and smells spices from across 3 continents. Janus finishes his day watching a nice gladiatorial fight at Rome's massive stadium, the Colosseum. John spends his day off attending church. After services, there'll be a market day, oh boy, with peddlers and storytellers and maybe even a maypole. John hopes the peddlers bring some more apples from the village next door, but no such luck. The peddler caravan got waylaid by bandits. No market today. Poor John. How do we explain this disconnect? Janus lived at the height of the Roman Empire, around 100 CE.
All right, so you can see the difference, that they had a much different life than it's gone downhill. And it starts to come back a little bit. If you remember, we had a lot of monks and monasteries copying Bibles on parchment. And, and that was very painstaking, and there weren't a lot of books. The Normans invade England in 1066. French and German come to start making the English language. Paper comes in. From China, a lot of people use paper as an essay topic, and that was an excellent one. And then try this again on another browser.
In Europe, the Middle Ages was a time period that spanned from around the 5th century until around the 15th century. This is a time considered between antiquity, think of the ancient Romans and Greeks, and modern periods. The Middle Ages can be divided into 3 separate time periods: the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages. For this lesson, we will focus on how people learned and were taught during the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages lasted from the 11th century through around the end of the 13th century. During this time period, crop production increased quickly because of some new technology. Agricultural advances led to an increase in the population of Europe. Also during this time, a military campaign pushed Christians to gain control of the Holy Land from the Muslims. Fighting occurred at intervals for years. These holy wars are known as the Crusades. In large part because of the Crusades, the High Middle Ages also experienced a rediscovery of classical knowledge. When using the term classical, we are generally referencing ancient Greece, especially ancient Greek scientists or philosophers like Aristotle. People living in ancient cultures were curious. They wondered about the stars and the human body. They developed mathematical practices.
See, the Europeans lost a lot of that during the Dark Ages. It was during the Crusades when they came back and they found the library at Alexandria, the storehouse of many of the books that they had lost: philosophy, astronomy. The Arabs were also very good at astronomy and math. Algebra. Algebra is an Arab word. So we brought back, they brought back a lot of the knowledge. And
People who lived near the Mediterranean Sea, like the Greeks, studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Essentially, they were studying wisdom. Romans wrote about literature, history, and politics. One of the most important means of preserving and spreading knowledge was the development of paper and books. Text was originally kept on stone tablets, but eventually parchment was developed. Parchment was made from stretched animal skin. Early books made from this material were expensive. In the 8th century, Asians developed a cheaper writing material, paper. Creating paper became popular and spread through Africa and Europe. Books became more accessible and more abundant. Prior to the 11th century, knowledge in Western Europe was somewhat limited. Many books and manuscripts were being preserved by the church.
Okay. And then you have the rise of this is what the Crusades were like.
Bounty versus the old family dish towel. Drying with a fresh sheet of Bounty leaves your hands cleaner than a used dish towel that can carry and redistribute food residue. So ditch the dish towel for better hand hygiene. Bounty, the quicker picker-upper.
The Crusades were first and foremost an expression of papal authority against the enemies of the church.
The first crusade was preached by a pope, Pope Urban II, in France in the year 1095. With reference to the Muslims and their advance in Europe and in Jerusalem, I think the Christians in Europe believed that the Islamic message of Muhammad was against and contradictory to what the Christians were saying. They were worried that this idea could possibly overrun the Christian idea.
Pope Urban conceived this idea. It's not a sin if you kill non-Christians, if you kill non-believers in our faith. And so he made this deal that if you go and fight in the Holy Land, you will be forgiven all your past sins. A knight could sin as much as he liked. And simply by going to the Holy Land, he had been given his passport to heaven. And that was an extremely attractive deal. And combined with that, he could win fame, he could win glory, and he could come back with the treasures of the Near East. These are the things that drew knights in their tens of thousands to go on crusade.
When you think about the brutality of the Crusades, you think about what was done to the people that were there. This just flies in the face of what the Christian message is all about.
Remember that these guys embrace the same God, many of the same beliefs, same prophets, and yet the streets ran deep with their blood. It shows the extraordinary power of ideas to take hold of people's minds and drive them to commit acts of great sacrifice and love on the one hand, but also acts of tremendous barbarity and hatred on the other. It's the double-edged sword of religious belief.
The bloodletting of the Crusaders spread throughout the Islamic lands. Everybody heard stories about the massacre of unarmed individuals. It created this intense rage amongst Muslims. In a sense, it resulted in a new kind of Muslim crusade, a desire to raise an army to go back to liberate Jerusalem from the Crusaders as an act of piety on the part of Muslims.
I don't think any of those young men, either Christian or Muslim, could possibly have imagined that their struggle could possibly still be playing itself out 1,000 years later in the area that we call the Middle East today.
This is what I wanted you to get, that we're going back and forth in that same area in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East. We are still fighting that same cultural war, and at the same time, bringing back new ideas from different cultures. So, and when they come back, you start
Because your
getting
passion
university.
never runs out, you deserve monthly income that does the same. Guaranteed growth in any market, and guaranteed monthly income for life when you retire.
During the early Middle Ages, any type of higher education was usually only available in monasteries and cathedral schools, where Christian monks and nuns taught each other and preserved the writings of classical authors. By the 11th century, medieval Europe was becoming more urban and complex, and royal governments needed highly trained men to run their bureaucracies. Students and teachers were also demanding better ways to be educated, and the solution to this came about with the creation of universities. Universities come from the Latin word universitas, which means guild, and these schools were essentially groups of students and teachers who got together into their own groups for the purposes of learning. In some universities, it was the students themselves who paid the teachers and ran the institution. The main curriculum was based on 7 areas: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy, all of which were important for a cleric in the Catholic Church. In some universities, other subjects were also important. That is, Salerno was renowned as a place to study medicine, and Bologna was known for law. By the 12th and 13th centuries, universities were becoming important centers of learning, and some would become quite famous, like Oxford and Cambridge in England, and the University of Paris in France. In later Middle Ages, universities would emerge in most other parts of Europe too, as monarchs and cities wanted them as sources of highly skilled bureaucrats and to increase their own reputations. Occasionally, though, the relationships between university students and their local communities could get hostile. And since students were treated as clergy, it meant that they could not be tried by local courts for crimes, only in the much more lenient ecclesiastical courts. While very few medieval men and no women could be part of a university, the institution did develop and grow throughout the Middle Ages and became home to some of the period's greatest thinkers, such as Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas. The university has since become the standard of higher education, not just in Europe, but throughout the world. To learn more about medieval.
So, as you saw, we went from having monks copying Bibles to people coming back with different ideas, growing the university, growing education. And education.
And they have no more brains than we've got.
Yeah. And education demands books. Plague decimates Europe. Again, pandemic. A lot of people died off. Climate change. got a colder climate. They call it the Little Ice Age. So the land was less productive. Modern English starts coming in and Chaucer. The Turks move into Turkey, move into the Holy Land, and then capture Istanbul, and that kind of cuts off the access to that area, to that knowledge, to that culture. What kind of effects do you think that had? Well, they cut off their markets and their effects. They went in the other direction. 1492, they found something else in another direction. One of the big reasons is the printing press. Yes, that is correct. But the most important, printing press was called the most important invention of the millennium. Why is that? In the year 2000, historians got together and decided that that was going to be, that they named that the most important thing that happened, the biggest invention in the prior 1,000 years. Why is that?
Well, gee, I wonder if this current millennium will have a most important invention.
Well, I think we have one for this century, that's for sure, certainly changed. Big thing about the printing press. It disseminated information. More people were able to read. And if they were able to read, they got their own ideas. They didn't get everything from the priest or the government. They started thinking for themselves. It also manufactured books and papers. Before, everything was handmade. This was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that things began to be manufactured, and the first thing that gets manufactured is ideas.
One-off, but for most people in the Middle Ages, this was an academic problem. They couldn't read or write anyway. During the Middle Ages, books were written out by hand, mostly in monasteries. Often the monks would spend years on a work. Then, in 1450, an invention changed the world. In the German city of Mainz, Johannes Guttenberg invented the technique of printing with movable type. This made it possible to duplicate books in large numbers and at relatively low cost. The technological foundation was laid for the intellectual, political, and religious changes of the succeeding centuries. Johannes Gensfleisch, who later changed his name to Gutenberg, was born in Mainz in around 1400. His father was a wealthy merchant. Young Johannes attended the monastic school in Mainz, that much we know, but then his trail goes cold for a while.
We'll skip some of this stuff and go to the important parts. In those days, printing...
The early Middle Ages. Here it served primarily for the dissemination of pictures and texts.
Right, they were making woodcuts and wood blocks. Some people use that in their essay.
But cutting these whole-page blocks is a time-consuming process. First, a mirror image of the handwritten page has to be drawn on the block. Then the individual letters have to be carved out. Finally, the block is inked in, and the sheet of paper is laid on top and rubbed hard with a bone tool so that it takes up the ink. By the start of the 15th century, more and more of these page prints were coming onto the market. Occasionally, a number of pages were bound into a book. The trade in these books also gave a boost to manuscript production. Manuscripts had long since ceased to be the exclusive preserve of the monasteries. Secular scribes were doing good business. The establishment of the first universities had created a great demand for books. Libraries were founded, making knowledge in the form of books accessible. Books needed to be cheaper and more quickly available. But that wasn't all. In particular, scholars wanted uniform copies. A new production technique was feverishly sought after. And one of the seekers was Gutenberg. In 1446, he returned to Mainz. Here, he found solid financial backers, allowing him to go ahead with his enterprise. His breakthrough came with a brilliant idea. He broke up his text into its constituent parts: letters, punctuation marks, and frequent combinations known as ligatures. These were then combined to form the blocks for printing words, lines, and pages. The characters were cast and could be used in new combinations time and again. A character is produced as follows. On the end of a metal rod, a mirror image of the letter is engraved. This is then pushed into softened copper, producing a pit in the shape of the letter. This matrix, as it's called, acts as the mould for the actual type, which is cast from lead. In order to manufacture the many letters needed quickly and in sufficient quantity, Gutenberg took another important step forward, inventing the hand casting instrument. It consists of a rectangular channel. The matrix is inserted at one end and molten lead poured into the other. When the instrument is opened, a letter cast in lead is there, ready to be used. As the matrix is reusable, an unlimited number of identical letters can be cast. Finally, the typesetter can begin to combine the letters into lines. In the form, the lines or columns are combined to create the page layout as desired. The result is a mirror image of the page to be printed. The form is now inked in with printer's ink. Gutenberg used a mixture of lampblack, varnish, and egg white. Printing can now start. Gutenberg used a special press for this purpose, but he derived the principle from the traditional wine press.
Yeah, I wanted to show you a little bit of that. The press here. This is why we call it the press.
Special press for this purpose.
See, what that does is that pushes the paper onto the plate, squashes it on there so it can pick up the ink. This is why we call print media the press, because he is pressing that paper onto the plate, and That's why we call it the press. This little lever is called the printer's devil.
Purpose, but he derived the principle from the traditional wine press. Gutenberg's first printed works were official documents, papal decrees, and grammars. But soon he started on a mammoth venture, the Latin Bible. For this project, he cast more than 100,000 pieces of type. For more than 2 years, Gutenberg's typesetters and printers worked on the first edition of 180 copies. The text was printed in black letter or Gothic type, based on the handwriting of the day. Finally, the illuminator added the colored initials and drawings. With his Bible, one of the world's most beautiful printed books, Gutenberg proved that a work printed with movable type could be as aesthetically pleasing as one written by hand. The edition was soon sold out. Gutenberg's contemporaries were impressed. It was the first time a work had been available in such a large edition, and every copy was identical. The written word now had authoritative status. Knowledge of this revolutionary technology was quick to spread. Soon, the first printing presses were set up in Cologne, Bamberg, and Basel. In Venice, an enterprising publisher named Aldus Manutius began to print the works of the classical authors. His clientele comprised the whole of Europe's humanistic intellectual elite.
Julius Caesar, I told you, the histories were locked up in the library at Alexandria and elsewhere. The Crusaders brought him back, and that's why we know about Caesar.
Manutius employed the most talented printers of the age. They developed the typeface known as Antiqua, which soon spread throughout Europe. "20 years after Gutenberg's invention, the new technology was firmly established. Thousands of titles were marketed in editions of up to 1,000.
Books and ideas spread throughout Europe. And as we said about the alphabet, you don't even need to speak the same language. It's the same alphabet in French and English. William Caxton shortly thereafter sets up printing in England.
Books now became affordable for ordinary people. As society grew more literate, the number of potential readers increased.
Right. Reading increased. Why is that a thing?
It was the end of the Middle Ages, the start of the Renaissance. In the mid-1400s, when Europe was in a great rebirth, what is probably one of the most influential inventions in history was created. Created by Johannes Guttenberg, the printing press suddenly allowed for the mass printing of ideas. The printing press allowed ideas to spread much faster and greatly aided education. In the process, it changed the world. During the Middle Ages, most people could not read. They looked to the church to teach them about religion and how to live life. The printing press began to help people learn to read. Slowly, people became educated beings who could think for themselves. Luther came to Rome as a priest, he was enraged at the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences was the act of the clergy, religious leaders.
See, what happened was, and this is a huge part of the printing press, people started reading their Bible. And when they talk about indulgences means you pay the priest, they forgive your sins, you reserve a place in heaven. People started reading Bibles themselves and go, aha, that's not in the Bible. They start questioning authority. They start thinking for themselves. Luther is one of them. And because you have the printing press, his ideas survive no matter what happened to him. And he lived, he didn't get burned at the stake, but his ideas spread throughout Europe.
Leaders selling indulgences, places in heaven to people or their loved ones. Martin Luther himself was getting an indulgence when he observed that many of the people who were getting indulgences were poor. All of a sudden, it dawned upon him that religious leaders were taking money from the poor, the people who needed it most. He realized that the only way to buy a place in heaven was through complete repentance, asking forgiveness, and by acting righteously. He wrote these flaws of the Catholic Church and many others on paper, calling people to a debate on whether or not to change the church. This paper was named the 95 Theses. People liked his ideas. They took the paper to a printing press and printed copy after copy of the 95 Theses. They spread the papers everywhere and even posted one on the doors of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. Thus began the Protestant Reformation, the countless battles fought to create other branches of Christianity. Martin Luther was called to attend a trial at the Diet of Worms, a trial for heretics, people who questioned the church. Here he was asked to recant, to take back his words. In response, he uttered the famous line, "I cannot and will not recant." He was then excommunicated, kicked out of the church. On his way back from the Diet of Worms, Frederick the Wise, a prince, kidnapped Martin Luther to save him from the fate that nearly all heretics faced, death. Martin Luther was brought back to the castle of Frederick the Wise. He lived there for 2 years, translating the Bible into the local language and writing powerful writings.
See, as I always said, Gutenberg's Bible was in Latin. Luther translated it into German so regular people could read it and well, aha, I could read this in my own language and think for myself.
All to be printed on a printing press for his ideas to spread faster. Now that it was translated, people began to read the Bible for themselves, meaning that they finally weren't just listening to the clergy. And along with this, they began to question the Catholic Church. A ferocious religious war took place between the Catholics and the Protestants. If it weren't for the printing press, the Protestants may never have been able to break away from the Catholics. Speed was key at this time, as Catholics were killing Luther's followers fast. The printing press greatly sped up the spread of Luther's ideas, increasing the numbers of his followers at a faster rate than they could be killed. If it weren't for the sudden speed at which Luther's ideas spread across Europe, the Protestants would have been fiercely outnumbered and massacred. Luther's followers succeeded in a short time to break apart from the Catholic Church, creating the Lutheran Church. By doing this, the Lutherans paved the path for new.
They started thinking, aha, I could have my church. And then the Baptists looked and said, hey, maybe I'll have my church. And the Wesleyans later. So everybody, that's the other side of it. Everybody has their own ideas. And so they split off.
Sects of the church to appear. As the Renaissance and Reformation progressed, the printing press continued to change the thinking of the European world. As scientists, philosophers, mathematicians, and many other great thinkers of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution began to perform their great.
There's Newton. You have the idea of gravity, Copernicus, and the idea that the world revolved around the sun. All of these ideas that were absolutely new came in wide distribution because of the printing press.
And productive lives, they were able to gain great fame and money through publishing their works. By printing their books and writings, the ideas of Marco Polo, Leonardo Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Buonarroti, Nikolaus Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, and many more great thinkers became more influential and changed the thinking of the time. Some of them were able to gain money as their writings sold. Therefore, the printing press introduced a new part of the economy, publishing. Marco Polo lived during the early stages of the Renaissance. He became a very famous traveler after he traveled through Asia and China and back to Europe with his father and uncle over the course of 24 years.
And what about going in the other direction? Before Columbus, the British were here, the Vikings were here, but when Columbus discovered America, it stayed discovered.
Yeah, the New World.
Because the printing press, they published the narrative of his voyages.
When he returned, he published a book telling of the wonders and luxuries of Asia. This was an immensely important action, as it encouraged trade in Europe, which may have completely launched it into the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci was one of the most famous polymaths, or Renaissance men. This is because he contributed to many areas of expertise. An accomplished architect, sculptor, painter, musician, scientist, mathematician, engineer, inventor, anatomist, geologist, cartographer, botanist, and writer. He made himself wealthy by publishing his findings in his areas of expertise with the help of the printing press. As he lived, many of his ideas and events were recorded in publications. Michelangelo was another of the most famous polymaths of the Renaissance. His areas of expertise included sculpting, painting, architecture, poetry, and engineering. His ideas and creations were published in countless biographies about him, two of which were published in his lifetime. This meant that Michelangelo's ideas spread with the help of the printing press. Nikolaus Copernicus was a multi-talented man of the scientific revolution. He earned a name for himself as a mathematician, jurist, physician, translator, artist, and most importantly, astronomer. He introduced the theory of the universe not existing around Earth, but Earth and other planets of the solar system revolving around the sun. He wrote a book on the revolutions of the celestial sphere.
They didn't publish his book until after he died. So it made a difference. Okay. More stuff out in the printing press. Nope, or very few, limited to kings and priests. We talked about that last time. But it was all handwritten until the printing press. You saw how that worked. The Bible in Latin. But again, people started reading themselves and started having their own ideas. There you go. We'll talk about this next time. Tried to control the press through licensing, saying you have to have a license from the king in order to operate a printing press. Again, from the very beginning, you have free speech and an attempt to try to control speech. You can read the Bible in your own language and ask for question it yourself, not relying on a priest who spoke Latin and you didn't. All, not just Bibles, everything. Literacy, schools, everybody's learning to read and in their own language. Beforehand, you consider yourself part of Christian Europe. Now, if you're reading in German or French or English, you're German, French, or English. Critical thinking. We talked about the Reformation already. The Renaissance, scientific. Yes, you can have your own thoughts. And that is huge. Based on the Greeks, who they brought back from the Arab world. That's why it's a big, hairy deal. Okay. That's why it's the most important thing that happened in 1,000 years. Next time, we will have next time we'll move on to England and why that became important, and the idea of free expression and free press. Also, we'll have next Thursday and Friday a little extra credit quiz to keep you engaged. 5 points for just giving it a try. All right. Any other questions, comments? Any other things going on? Well, otherwise, have a lovely couple of days, and I will see you in 2 days. See you Thursday.